Hello, and welcome to another episode of Politics at the Crossroads, the podcast that sits at the intersection of Christian faith and political conviction. In Politics at the Crossroads, I interview interesting Christians in the public square about where they are politically and how their faith helps them get there. In this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with Nigel Biggar. Nigel is Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at Christchurch College, the University of Oxford. Before that, he taught Theology and Ethics at Leeds and Trinity College, Dublin. Nigel has written on pretty much all of the big topics in ethics and public life, ranging from war and peace to medical ethics, euthanasia, the nation, and empire, and much more. He also has a new book out on rights with Oxford University Press, What is Wrong with Rights. I've come to greatly appreciate Nigel's willingness to combine careful Christian reflection with a realism that is firmly rooted in the messiness of human experience, and I think that this really shines through in what Nigel had to say in this episode. In the course of our conversation, we discussed rights and duties in the context of the pandemic, thinking Christianly about the nation, and the importance of realism. I hope that you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. Excellent. Okay, so the first question that I start off with, as I speak with each guest, is looking at where you sit politically and theologically or ecclesially. So I wonder if you could just paint a picture for those listening, or tell the story of where you are now and how you've come to where you are now.
So now I'm an Anglican priest, functioning part-time. My main vocation is as a Christian ethicist, and I occupy the Regius Chair of Moral and Pastoral Theology at Oxford. So I've been in and around the academic world the whole of my adult life. I did my first degree in history in Oxford in 1973 to 76. Went to North America to study theology, initially just for personal interest's sake, but spent 7 years there and ended up with a PhD in theology and ethics. Came back to this country, got ordained as an Anglican priest, was chaplain of Oriel College for 9 years, then went to Leeds as a professor, to Dublin, Trinity College as a professor, then back to Oxford as a professor 14 years ago. So how did I get where I am? Just let's wind way back. I mean, I was born in 1955. I'm 65 now. I was born in Scotland. My mother was a lapsed Methodist, and my father was a lapsed Presbyterian. I went to my local Church of Scotland church once and was so bored I never went again. But I was sent to a boarding school run by two evangelical Anglicans, and to cut a long story short, the rest is history. I became a confessing Christian at my boarding school age of 13, as an evangelical, but within, broadly speaking, the Anglican tradition, and have remained so ever since, in spite of the fact that my father, at my age of 12, put his hand on my shoulder, as he did only once in my life, I think, and said that it's okay, son, it's just a phase. So here we are, 50 years later, I'm still in the phase. So that's why I became a Christian, not because I was born into it. My elder brother did not become a Christian. I've always been slightly allergic to institutions. I like to be on the outside of the inside, and so it took me a long time to decide to present myself for ordination as a priest. I was ordained deacon at the age of 35, I think. in many basic respects, I remain evangelical in the sense that my view of my theological views are orthodox. I believe the resurrection happened to Jesus, not just in the minds of his disciples, for example. And the kind of God I want to believe in is one who would not stand on his own rank and become flesh and get down and dirty with the rest of us. That's the kind of God I think is worth believing in. And I do hope for the afterlife. I have no idea how we're going to get there or how the world's going to be put right, but seeing the mess the world is in and seeing how intractable problems tend to be, I pray for the coming of the kingdom of God, whatever that means. So I'm theologically orthodox, but as is usually the case, many people enter the church through an evangelical door, but then broaden, and I've broadened considerably. And we can talk about that now. I mean, I guess I spent a lot of my years as a graduate student studying Karl Barth, but I also, since then especially, have become very keen on Roman Catholic scholastic Thomist thinking. So that's where I am ecclesially and theologically. Politically, as I said, I'm 65, born in 1955. I grew up, I was coming to consciousness in the 60s, when everything was becoming liberalized and flower power was regnant, and also the traditional dominant sexual mores about drugs, homosexuality, all these things were being challenged in the post-war period. And for reasons that I don't, quite hard to explain, I find myself watching these developments with some reservation. And I like to say that I was born in the 60s, but I was never of the 60s. My inner Edwardian survived to this day. So I was always skeptical. Why? It's hard to say. My older brother, 6 years older than me, was entirely of the zeitgeist. Had Jeremy Corbyn been around then, he'd have voted for him. Whereas I wouldn't have touched Corbyn with a barge pole. So there's a bit of mystery, as there often is in personal stories, why you turn out one way rather than another. But I mean, I was, and this comes up to the present day. I mean, at that time, all sorts of British sacred cows were being slaughtered. So 10 years before I was born, or at least 13 years before I was born, this country was saved from the Luftwaffe by brave 20-something-year-old Battle of Britain pilots in the 60s. So when I was born, they were heroes and deserved to be. In the 60s, they became the subject of mockery, thanks to Monty Python and later Blackadder. And I thought to myself, really? I mean, I get that every generation gets to mock its parents' heroes, but these 20-somethings were risking their lives for the country, and you mock them? Really? So it was that. And there was also the whole empire thing. I mean, the sense of, in the 60s, that's when Britain, most of the decolonization took place. And there was a sense of decline and disorientation and what did this mean, and lack of confidence. And I think all my life I've borne the tensions and the anxieties and the pain of that in myself. And part of my vocation, I think, has been to work through that and come to some understanding of what my country should be. So I think I've always had conservative instincts, but living in a liberalizing period, moving increasingly to the left, at least as far as the elites were concerned. And so I've always been aware of appearing to be on the wrong side of history, and for many years just kept my mouth shut until I got older and one of the things you learn when you get older is, first of all, you figure out what you think, and secondly, you cease to care what other people think about what you think. So you say it. And so the fact is, I voted for all three main political parties in my life. I voted New Labour, I voted Lib Dem, I voted Tory. I shan't tell you what I vote now, but I voted for all of them. So I'm kind of floating centrist voter, but with conservative instincts. But just in the last, I think in the last 7-8 years, partly a combination of my personality with circumstance, I find myself giving voice to my conservative convictions with increasing confidence, as you will have noticed.
Thank you very much.
I could go on, but you better stop me.
No, thanks so much for sharing that. I suppose, I mean, there are a lot of threads to pick up there and discuss. Perhaps just initially, I mean, how you mentioned on the ecclesial-theological side, the evangelical tradition, and obviously that's going through its own sort of interesting moment just now, especially with what's been happening in the States with Donald Trump, and at a personal level, that's led me, because that's actually my home as well. Broadly speaking, I though prefer to use the label of reformed, partly strategically to head off concerns about what's happened across the ocean in recent years, but partly also just, I suppose, I see there being a lot more history there, a lot more, I suppose you could say, tradition of thinking through issues. Evangelicalism is a fairly recent vintage. But yeah, I just wondered what your experience of evangelicalism more recently has been with recent events.
Well, first of all, I'm perhaps not as allergic to the label as you are. I mean, there are plenty of evangelicals who would be rather surprised to hear me describe myself as evangelical, because they're not quite sure that I am. But I'm not unhappy to own the label. But you notice I qualified it by saying I'm theologically orthodox. But also because it's quite clear to me that British evangelicalism is not the same as American evangelicalism. I mean, that said, of course, there are different American evangelicalisms, some more thoughtful, some more reformed, self-consciously reformed, Calvin College, of course, than others. But when I say evangelical, I guess I'm thinking of it in relation to the 1960s, when the alternative, or a major alternative apart from the Anglo-Catholic tradition, was liberal, and liberal meant Bultmann, and that meant, as I intimated, that the resurrection was an event in the minds of the disciples. It didn't happen to Jesus. And I have to say, no, the resurrection needs to happen to the real world. The world needs to be transformed, not just my mentality. So that's when I pin my flag to the evangelical mountain. That's what I have in mind. But I suppose you're right. I mean, in the mind of the general public, evangelicalism will be associated with the least thoughtful American evangelical versions of it, and that might be a reason to keep one's distance. But I can't call myself simply reformed in that I although on strictly ecclesial matters, in terms of the Eucharist, in terms of the clergy, in terms of the church, I am reformed. I don't believe in transubstantiation. I have a fairly unromantic view of priesthood. I don't romanticize it. And as for the church, well, we all know the church can be as sinful as any other institution, and sometimes more so. So in that sense, I'm reformed, and I have a skeptical view of authority. But I'm not simply reformed insofar as I said, I find lots in Catholic tradition, particularly in the moral tradition, particularly its intellectual rigor and clarity, something to be admired, and I identify myself with that end of Catholic tradition.
Excellent, thank you. I suppose on the political side as well, it's fair to say that that's, as you said, being a centrist voter that might lean conservative on certain cultural issues and so on. Again, not a popular place to be in one sense, as you said, in relation perhaps to universities today, and we can come back to that. You mentioned this is something, you talked about this being slightly mysterious in terms of your own history coming to that. Do you think was there a particular moment that drew you in that direction, or a particular experience, or was it just a sort of accumulation of things that happened, of convictions over time?
It's really hard to say. I mean, of course, I'm not. We need to talk about what being conservative means, and I think one reason you're quite right, actually, not to interview me as a conservative or interview someone else as a typical Marxist is oftentimes most people are rather more complicated than that, and the labels of left and right just don't fit properly. So, for example, when I was growing up, I took a conservative traditional line on homosexual practice. I no longer do. So I'm no longer conservative on that matter. And I some time ago, I figured out that my line on this is that whether you find me liberal or conservative depends on what we're talking about and who I'm talking to.
Right.
So it's all relative. But in terms of those parts of me that are conservative, I mean, I do think it was growing up in a time of national flux and uncertainty and anxiety. I mean, the other thing I had mentioned to you, which in terms of my politics is quite formative, I was politically conscious in the 1970s. Now, anyone at my age knows what that means. You probably don't. What it meant to me was 1973, October, in my Beaumont Street, Worcester College room, preparing for my first set of exams by candlelight because all the power stations were shut because there was no coal, because the coal mines were on strike. And I learned to drink my sugar without tea, my tea without sugar for the first time, because there was no sugar. Why? Because the ports were all closed. And I read leading articles in the Times newspaper, a series of which was called "Is Britain Governable?" And the 1970s, 73, in the early 70s is when the violence in Northern Ireland was at its height. Mid 70s, Britain went to the International Monetary Fund for a loan so it could stay solvent. It was a very, very, very bad time. And as a young Christian, I was asking myself, what has the Christian faith got to say to this? So I think, now, of course, there undoubtedly were other Christians who were cheering for the miners. I ended up being much more sympathetic to Margaret Thatcher because it seemed to me that something radical had to change, and that meant that the consensual politics that we've been used to just wasn't working anymore, and risks had to be taken. So I think growing up then certainly had an influence on me, although I mean, my older brother was way out to the left of me. So it's hard to pinpoint those things. But the other thing I should say is, and this is quite mysterious to me, as I've told you, I spent 7 years in North America, in Canada and the States. I'm married an American. I could have made my life there and my career there. But I was absolutely clear in myself that the UK was my country, and I had to come back here. And this was where I had a vocation to fulfill. So I've always had a very, very strong sense of being British and of having a responsibility to do what I could for the good of this country. And I am willing to call myself a patriot, which of course Americans do without thinking twice, and British people in my own hearing never do. We may feel it, we just don't say it, but I'm willing to say it because it's true and it's not shameful. But why? Why do I have felt this way? God alone knows. I reach for the word vocation, meaning that here I am, this is the kind of person I am, here are my circumstances, and this is what it seems to me I should be doing. Other people, for reasons best known to God or them, are differently placed and differently formed. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a very honest and powerful reflection, I think, and it acknowledges in some senses, the mystery behind where we come to, but although the firm sense of conviction as well and calling. I wonder if we could turn on to the first big topic that I wanted to speak with you about, which is rights and duty. And I'd love to get thinking about, get your thoughts on rights within the context of the pandemic and the lockdown, if you don't mind. But before then, it would be remiss of me not to mention that you have a book out with Oxford University Press just last year in September, I believe, called "What's Wrong with Rights?" ? I wondered if you could tell us just a bit about what you're arguing in this book.
Right. So the book is a genuine question, and was inspired by my awareness that there are a number of different questions and doubts about rights, and I wanted to work my way through them to figure out what I thought, because rights talk is pervasive, and it often pushes all other moral talk off the table. And I wanted to get the measure of this. So the book argues a variety of things according to what the question is, but there is a view which you'll find among some Christians and some Christian theologians, and I'm thinking here of Alistair MacIntyre, the Roman Catholic philosopher, and Joan Lockwood O'Donovan, the Reformed Anglican theologian, that there is something un-Christian about the very concept of a right. That's to say, as a property an individual possesses. And it's supposed that a right as a property of an individual tends to become the expression of the individual ego. So my rights, it's all about the assertion of the ego, of the ego's needs in terms of a moral claim. And so that's what one question raised. And I consider that, and I decide it's wrong. It's incorrect. That yes, rights can become the vehicle of unrestrained egos, but and this is one of the main conclusions of the book. As social institutions, that's to say, as legal rights, rights are important ways of making secure our access to certain freedoms and to certain benefits, whether it's freedom from arbitrary arrest, or whether it's a right to healthcare, as legal rights are important ways of ensuring our access to things that help us flourish. And so to legal rights as such, I have no objection, and I think Christians should have no objection. The difficulty comes when we talk about moral rights or natural rights, and there, in the end, I decide, although we can talk about them with some good sense, it's best not to talk about them because they mislead. Just to explain one reason why they mislead. Since I think that a right is primarily a legal thing, a right is a moral claim which is stronger because it is sanctioned by law and has the backing of police and courts. So if you threaten not to respect my right, I can appeal to a social institution to enforce my right against you. That's why it's a right and not just any old claim. So it's a strong form of claim made strong by social institutions. And that's what I think, that's the basic concept of a right. Now, if you start to think about a right as natural, that's to say, as existing where there are no supporting institutions, then you mislead because you imply a degree of security that doesn't exist.
Could you give an example, perhaps, of a natural or moral right?
Yeah, so some people say that because having sufficient nutrition is essential for human existence, there is a natural right against hunger or against starvation, let's say. And that there are, I know of some philosophers who say that. And the logic seems to be, given this is so important, surely we all have a right to it. Right. Well, no, you don't. You may have a moral claim you can lay against those who appear to have more than you to help you, but you don't have a right because here you are starving, I don't know, in Saharan Africa, and we're in the 13th century. Now, it may well be that in Istanbul, people have a surplus of wealth, and that if they knew you were starving, if they had the means to get it to you, and if they had a special responsibility to relieve your hunger, and if they acknowledged all these things, you would have a right against them. But as it happens, they don't know you are starving, they don't have the means, and they have special responsibilities elsewhere. So if you have a right, you need someone to claim it against, and someone who is obliged, all other things considered, to meet your need. And there may be circumstances, it all depends on circumstances, there may be circumstances where it is terrible and tragic that you're starving, but no one else is able or morally obliged, or even morally allowed to help you. So that's why I do believe in, as a Christian, I do believe in moral order. I do believe there are moral duties, and sometimes those are in a symmetrical relationship with rights. So if I have a right, then you have a duty. But sometimes there are duties that are not reciprocated by rights. So if you're starving, and I have more than enough to feed myself or my people, and I know you're starving, and I can help you, I have a duty to help you as much as I can. Whether that will do the trick, whether it will relieve you of starving, or how many of you it will relieve of starving, we don't know. So I have, as it were, an imperfect obligation, but you don't have a right against me. So I just think when we talk about natural rights, we imported expectations that are actually not realistic. I mean, if there is international law and there's an international organization which means that whenever famine arises, it's clear who is responsible for doing what, then the starving have a right against them. But we haven't reached quite that level of international organization yet.
Yeah, it's interesting. This places quite a lot of emphasis and quite a lot of responsibility, it seems to me, on. I mean, this argument sounds very Burkean, to draw on sort of Edmund Burke's notions of social institutions, of kinship, of duty to those around you, and yeah, I mean, there's one quote. I think this might be from the book cover itself rather than the book, but part of what you're trying to do is offer a richer public discourse about ethics, one that includes talk about the duty and virtue of rights holders. I just wondered if briefly you might be able to talk about how your Christian faith, perhaps a particular part of the Christian tradition, influenced how you came to this argument.
Yeah. Well, first of all, just on the Burkean bit, Simeon, I devote a large part of the first chapter to expounding Burke, and in the end, I'm aware that I adopt quite a strongly Burkean position. As for the bearing of Christian thought on this, one of the main inspirations for, or provocations for exploring this issue was through my earlier work in the ethics of war. So you have this tradition of Christian thinking about when war is justified, the so-called just war tradition, which runs roughly from Augustine in the early 5th century to the present day. And exploring that, I became aware that Christian thinking about the ethics of war does not use the concept of a right at all. And then I came across a moral philosopher who published a book in which he lays out his ethic of killing, where the concept of a right to life is central. And it produces a very different result. And I wanted to figure out, what does this mean? Does it mean that this guy has figured out something important that the Christian tradition simply missed? Should we start talking about the ethics of killing in terms of right to life? Or, as I suspected, does the importation of this concept of a right to life actually harden, distort, make less flexible an ethic of killing? So the Christian just war thinking says that if I'm a soldier fighting a just war and you're an enemy civilian, I'm forbidden to intentionally harm you. I must take whatever measures I can to avoid harming you. But if you happen, tragically, to be sat next to a really important military target occupied by my unjust enemy, and if I really have to attack this thing, and I have nothing else with which to attack it, except with the kind of weapons that are likely to kill you, I can strike.
Yeah, it's a discriminate
side effect.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. So I, as a soldier, I have a duty not to intend to kill you, to search for means of avoiding risking your life. But if the act of, if out of military necessity, the risking of your life is proportionate and unintended, I may do it. But here's the thing, I get to decide that. Your fate is not in your hands. And in the absence of international institutions, you have no one to appeal to, except my conscience. Now, some people will say, well, that's not right. That's not correct. We need to harden the protection of civilians. And we could do that, just at the expense of making it more likely that we won't win wars. Because the more you restrain the discretion of soldiers in the field, the less likely they are to win. And if you're a pacifist, that's all good, because all war is bad. But if you want to win the war against the Nazis, then you have to allow aircraft to bomb from a very great height, using technology that can't be precise, and therefore risk, or in fact kill, 34,000 French civilians. Okay. So since I'm not a pacifist, and since I think wars sometimes need to be fought and won, I want to give soldiers room for discretion. And there are ways of making sure it's not just conscience. I mean, there is military training, and there are ways of monitoring what officers decide and what they don't decide. But if you establish in law a right of civilians against being harmed, then I think the effect will be to paralyze soldiers in the field, which we could do if we're willing to take the consequences.
Yeah.
But it is really striking to me that the Christian tradition, when thinking about these things, does not talk of a right at all. And the reason I've given just now is why. And the attempt to import rights language into this discussion of the ethics of killing. For example, the person I'm thinking of is David Roden, and he says that we all have a right to life against harm unless we do something morally culpable that causes us to forfeit our right. Now, that might sound attractive until you think about this. I mean, if I'm clinically insane and I decide to take a Kalashnikov into a primary school and shoot all the kids there, then you as a police officer, according to this ethic, may not shoot me. Why? Because I'm insane and I'm not responsible for what I'm doing. So I've done nothing culpable to forfeit my right. Now, we could do that, but you have to be willing to take the consequences.
Yeah. I wonder if we could move on to consider, stay with the related issue of rights and duties, but move into the context of the pandemic, of the coronavirus pandemic. And I should say that we're recording this, of course, the day after the announcement of the government's roadmap taking us out of lockdown, hopefully within the next 100+ days.
Please go on.
Yes, indeed. It seems to me that the whole pandemic situation has really re-injected public ethics, public morality into the limelight, into the conversation once again, with a new urgency, because of course we had the Iraq war, I suppose is within my own lifetime, the banking crisis, 2008 and so on. It seems that COVID has injected passion again into our ethical discussions. At the same time, though, it seems to me that we've sort of haven't exactly passed the test with flying colors when it comes to having a public conversation around the pandemic, particularly around government restrictions, not least the measure of lockdown. And I know that you've contributed a very thoughtful piece, I thought, to the periodical, the article back in May last year, entitled "An Ethic for the Epidemic." So now that we're almost a year on, I just wondered, what are your thoughts on the ethical discussions around lockdown or on pandemic, as an ethicist yourself?
Yeah. I think my views haven't changed much in 12 months. And perhaps I should just preface what I'm going to say by saying that if you're sitting in government, I mean, trying to manage this thing, notwithstanding appeals to scientific authority, trying to manage it is not a science. I mean, it's a matter of gauging risks and not knowing the future and not knowing this beast. I mean, this is a new virus. We don't know how we're only learning how it behaves. More than many people, I'm inclined to give whoever's in government dealing with this thing a lot of slack and to be forgiving of mistakes, because frankly, mistakes are bound to be made because we don't have full knowledge and we don't know how things are going to develop. So that's the first thing I'd say. Let's be forgiving. And I say that partly because it seems to me that generally speaking, we are not well served by a media which tends to self-righteousness when it comes to government, not taking into account how extremely difficult it is and how all the conflicting wants and demands of the electorate cannot be met. So there's that. In what I wrote 12 months ago in an ethic for the epidemic, I was not sympathetic to the libertarian line, which some folk are pushing, some friends are pushing, in fact, that individuals should be free to make their own decisions without state interference, because what individuals decide does have an impact on other people, and government is responsible for the public good. And if my decisions don't impact directly on other people, then it may be that I should be left in freedom to make whatever mistakes I want to make, because they don't impact other people. When they do impact other people, government has a responsibility. Now, whether government has been excessively restrictive, whether people my age should have been left to take their own risks, possibly. But then the concern is that if too many people my age, 65 and older, take risks that go bad, we end up in intensive care. And there are only so many beds in the NHS to put us. If we overwhelm the system, everybody suffers, not just us. So I think the government has a responsibility to adopt policies that serve the overall public good, and even if non-compliance isn't made illegal, every citizen has a duty to restrain themselves for the public good. And if that means we have to do without seeing our grandchildren for 6 months or 12 months, and we don't see friends, I mean, that's certainly a detriment, but it's not the end of the world. And speaking again from someone my age, my parents in World War II suffered far, far, far more. So let's get this in perspective. This is 12 to 18 months of disruption. And yes, people are dying, but without suffering restrictions, more people would die. So I just coming in there, if you're wondering why do I as a Christian think this way, just notice the way in which the word duty comes in. And the question of whether we have a right to see our grandchildren, as some have suggested. I think in law we don't. We could make a right. We don't have a right. And one of the reasons I complain about rights talk is that it's invoked as if it was an authority. I have a right to see my grandchildren. Well, legally you don't. And the question of whether morally you should, we have to discuss and conclude. So don't invoke a right at the beginning, which, as it were, trumps discussion. Let's discuss everything all considered, and we may decide that yes, you should be free, or not.
Well, hasn't that been, I mean, to play devil's advocate here, hasn't that been done on the other side with the right to safety and the right to, I suppose, life itself?
Yeah, I think so. Again, I don't think the word right is helpful here, because if you say there's a right, it appears as if a decision has been made, and we're in a situation now where we have to, I could say, balance freedom against safety, but the word balance is misleading because we're not weighing things up. We have to think, we have to reason our way through, which is it's a process of reasoning through to a considered judgment. And the conclusion of the judgment might be there should be a right to this or that in law, but it doesn't help to invoke it at the beginning because, in a sense, everything's up for grabs. You see?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought within the article as well, you were, correct me if I'm wrong, arguing that, I mean, you talked about, you questioned the idea of discrimination against the old, and you mentioned there that, well, we discriminate all the time in the sense of coming to a judgment of something. And you're saying there that the real question is this discrimination just or unjust? And you were saying that there's potentially a good reason for the over 60 bracket of the population, those people perhaps shielding themselves. That was my take on what you'd said. Perhaps I've got that wrong.
I can't remember entirely what I said.
Yeah.
But what you report seems right. I wanted to make the general point, that whereas we tend to think of discrimination as being wrong, just remind people that discrimination isn't wrong. Discrimination for poor reasons is wrong. So to discriminate against you because you're black is wrong. It's not a good reason. But to discriminate against you in the sense that here you are, 65-year-old, and if you don't shield yourself, we risk the NHS being overwhelmed to everyone's detriment, including yours. There is therefore a good reason why you, other than other people, should be required to shield yourself. So there's an unequal treatment, but it's got good reasons. And so I just wanted to say, first of all, discrimination is not all wrong, folks. It depends what the reasons are. And there might be good reasons to expect a certain section of the population to behave differently from others.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, thank you. I wonder if we could move on to another area that you've touched on in your own work and thought. This is I put them together, I suppose they're distinct concepts in themselves, but nation and empire. And in preparing for this interview, I was reading through your book, Between Kin and Cosmopolis, which was published by James Clark in 2014. And there you discuss nation, nationalism, the nation state, the common good, from a theological perspective, which is something that seems to be missing from the conversation, in my view. And you argue a number of things there, but among them, that nation states are here to stay, that the nation state, from a Christian perspective, deserves qualified loyalty, and that while nations should enjoy a measure of autonomy, this autonomy is to be used for the good of its citizenry, and as a means for that nation state to offer its distinctive and exceptional good to the world. It struck me again that this is an argument that's shot through with Augustinian overtones. And I wondered again if you might be able to talk about how you have come to this particular set of arguments in this book, and perhaps where you've drawn on the Christian tradition, the Christian scriptures, as you did so.
Yep. So that book is I mean, I'll be frank here. It is an attempt to rationalize long-held instincts I've had in theological terms, and to see if a theological case could be made in favor of them. So, as I explained, I've always had a strong attachment to the United Kingdom. I say in the book, and you'll remember this, I say that as a Christian, I cannot regard any nation as divine. Nations come and go. Before 1783, the United States didn't exist. Before 1707, the United Kingdom didn't exist. We may cease to exist if the Scots get their independence. Right. So as a Christian, let's be clear, no nation is here forever. But it does seem to me that as a matter of international fact, nation states are the primary agents in the world. We do have supranational institutions like the UN, but their power is often entirely dependent on nation states. So the UN has no troops of its own; it has to get them from nations. So contrary, 30 years ago, I remember speaking to an Anglican clergyman who then became a bishop, who was saying, as it was fashionable then, that the nation state, the era of the nation state is over. And I thought him wrong then, and I certainly think him wrong now. It's not over. So, but you asked about the kind of scriptural, theological backing for this notion of a limited loyalty to the nation state. And I think I develop it in terms of human creatureliness, that nowadays almost everyone is born into some nation state. Oftentimes, not always, they will benefit from the security and the ordered life and perhaps the prosperity that a nation state enables. Although we have loyalties to family and to regions and to international charities and international organizations, we do have multiple loyalties, but we also ought to have a loyalty to the nation state because it forms our lives for ill and for good. And it forms the nation state forms our lives more immediately than the United Nations or even the European Union or Amnesty International. And therefore, if we care about our neighbor, we need to care about what kind of nation state we live in. So it's which is not to say we don't care about other people's, but it is to say we we plenty of neighbors next door to worry about in the first instance. And it'd be very odd for us to want to claim to love humanity when we can't love the person right next door or in our town or in our nation. So let's have loyalty to the nation too. But again, as a Christian, loyalty is not uncritical. And if you love your country, it's only because you love your country you can sometimes hate it. Because to love your country is to expect high things of it. And when it falls short of what you expect, it's very disappointing. But if you're indifferent, you don't care either way. But you ought to care. You ought to care. And care sometimes can produce disappointment and therefore criticism. But you should be invested, partly because your own life depends on it, and partly because the lives of your neighbors depend on it. So I think it's a doctrine of creation that informs my notion of the limited, sometimes critical loyalty that Christians should have to the nation.
It's interesting that you wrote within the context just before, I think, the Scottish independence vote as well, and you had a passage there about autonomy and how the nation of Scotland could just as well express that autonomy from within the United Kingdom. Looking now at the fact that we are in a post-Brexit world, would you have updated that book in any way to have... I noticed actually that you almost you didn't almost, you did, you sort of predicted the EU referendum vote within that book. You mentioned that, I think that it was likely that there was a possibility that the UK would be leaving the European Union. But I wonder how you would maybe update the arguments, or what you'd say now to that.
Not so much. I mean, just on Brexit. Yes, I did think Brexit was quite possible. Just for the record, I voted Remain, just to confound conservative stereotypes. But I voted Remain on a kind of 52-48 basis. And when I woke up in Amsterdam to discover we'd voted to leave, and I merely thought, oh, interesting, different set of problems, different opportunities. Because it seemed to me that given the fact of the Eurozone, given its need to integrate politically, and given our being on the outside, that increasingly we would find ourselves marginalized and pushed to the edge, if not outside. So I didn't see Brexit as a huge revolution. But back to Scotland, I describe myself as being strongly attached to the United Kingdom. I'm Scottish born. I don't answer to English. I'm British. What does that mean? It means that I am aware, as many of us from the Celtic periphery are aware, that the UK is a multinational state. English people tend to forget that. We are a multinational state, and folks, whatever our tensions and our barbed jokes about each other, we enjoy a degree of international trust and solidarity that the EU can still only dream about. And if you're going to break that up, you have to have a bloody strong reason to do it. And although I am instinctively, I've always been instinctively anti-Scottish nationalism in the sense of separatism, I was willing, as a Christian, I was bound to consider the possibility that the days of the UK might be numbered, and maybe we should disintegrate, and maybe the Scots nationalists had a good case for independence. But I've before 2014 and since, I've done a lot of reading and thinking about it, and my view is that the reasons for Scottish independence are poor reasons, and that Scottish nationalism risks being a utopian illusion that will lead the Scots into deep disillusionment if they actually achieve what they wanted. It would also damage the rest of the UK. Now that's not a theological argument. It's a kind of moral, political reading of the situation. But in this case, I find myself, as a conservative Christian, arguing for the promotion of the United Kingdom, maybe with certain reforms. But part of the problem, as I see it, is that there's a good story to be told about Britain, but right now we're not telling it. In fact, we're telling narratives that are unfairly and untruthfully critical of what Britain has been. And I'm talking about the anti-colonialist and decolonialist campaigns at the moment.
Yes, yeah. Indeed.
Just in case you wanted to know what I thought.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just curious to know what you thought there, and I voted to Remain as well, and I identify very much with the idea of, well, not the idea, but the reality of the UK being multinational. I'm a pan Brit, I was born in Wales and raised in Northern Ireland, as Burke might give away.
I thought there was a bit of Irish in you.
Yeah, just the twang. And studied and have lived in Scotland and England, so I'm with you there. I wondered, move on to just the final kind of section here. on which we've touched on slightly already, which is on war and peace again. And I suppose this gets us into pulls together some of the strands that you've already touched on, particularly realism. I think that's come very strongly through a kind of common sense realism, it seems to me. And one of the questions I really wanted to ask you about is in relation actually to a pretty niche issue, but I think one that throws up a lot of questions about human nature and things. And this is the question of nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence, nuclear disarmament. I think I'm with you in terms of the realism that you bring to this question of war more generally, and I suppose nuclear weapons in particular. And it seems to me, as I say, that this issue of nuclear weapons lays bare our assumptions about human nature. The question I've always had on this one, and I wonder if you might be able to talk to, is I suppose it's quite a specific question in a way, but if we're going to be realistic about the capacity of human beings to wreak havoc and destruction, my question is sort of, why does that not then apply to the person with the finger on the trigger or with the nuclear codes on our side? So if we have this assumption about human capacity for evil, does that extend to those on our side as well? If not, why not?
Yeah. Just if I can just talk a bit about realism. I suppose I do think that Christians often tend to idealism, tend to what I called in my book on war, wishful thinking. And it's partly, and here Simeon is where someone like me as a Christian is weaker, partly because eschatological hope does call us to raise our sights and not to be complacent, not to settle for what is, but to move into a different future. And I acknowledge all that. But I, as a conservative, I am allergic to utopian politics. And there's a lot of that about right now. And I think Christians sometimes are prone to that. And in my own field of Christian ethics, I see a lot of it. Whereas I've partly, I think, because I was not brought up in the church, so I'm always, part of me is always was standing on the outside, looking in, or looking at what I'm saying and say, does this really stand up? Really stand up? I mean, so I have friends who work in government, and there was a moment when a colleague of mine referred to the war machine. We were talking about war and peace, and I stopped him. I said, Kian, when you talk about the war machine, I see faces of friends of mine who are in that machine and are quite as conscientious as you and I, and have to make decisions you and I, as academics, have spent our professional lives avoiding. And so although I'm by temperament an observer, an analyst, someone who reflects, I have a lot of respect for those in the front line, and I want what I say to be something they could respect. And an awful lot of what Christians say, people in the front line just can't respect, because it's not honest enough about the limits within which people have to operate. And I think it's actually also it's a pastoral failing, because you can't be a good pastor if you don't take seriously the situation which someone really is in, and the limited options they have. Anyway, that's a general thing about realism. On nuclear weapons, yeah, you're absolutely right. And as an Augustinian Christian here, I say, there's no absolute security here. On our own side or the other side. I mean, there can be fateful mistakes made by both. No, I'm not pretending that our side is secure. We could make dreadful mistakes. And much as though I if it were possible to rewind history and to abolish nuclear weapons multilaterally and to ensure that no one reinvents them again, if that were possible, I'd vote for it. But it ain't. If Britain's unilateral disarmament would shame Vladimir Putin or China into following us into unilateral disarmament, I might vote for it, but it won't. It'll simply, it seems to me, it would simply place even more of the burden of Western defense onto the US, and the US might get thoroughly fed up, as it deserves to get fed up sometimes with Europe and its free riding. So in some ways we're stuck. What we can do is to try and negotiate our way to multilateral disarmament, and the UK government has done more than most. We reduced our nuclear arsenal to about the minimum now. And anti-nuclear campaigners really ought to give us credit for that. But if China and Putin and Russia and North Korea are not going to be moved, there may not be much we can do except what we can do is to try and stop proliferation. And we've done that with some success. We stopped Libya acquiring nuclear weapons in the early noughties. But we live in a situation of risk and danger, and we've got to manage it. And unlike my perhaps more imaginative or more radical Christian brothers and sisters, I don't see a key that we can turn. And we have to live with this as prudently as possible. And maybe as a Christian, prudence isn't quite enough. We need to be alert to the moments when a certain diplomatic risk taking in order to create trust might actually make a difference. So we can't simply relax into the status quo. We also have to be alert to opportunities to move things along slightly. But you'll notice this is Burkean, this is gradual, this is not revolution, it's not radical. But the danger of radical politics, of utopian politics, of revolutionary politics, is that however well-intentioned, the actual effects can be the opposite of what you want. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that reflection. Just a final question, Nigel, as we come to the end of this conversation. And this question looks at more generally at the public conversations we have around politics, around culture as Christians. And so my question is twofold. So what perhaps can Christians learn from the small c conservative political philosophy that we've touched on? And what do you think, secondly, Christians can offer that philosophy?
Good questions. So what can Christians learn from conservative philosophy? Well, they can learn to appreciate better what they've been given. And in this country, we have been given, many of us, not all of us, enormous privileges by the past. And we ought not to take that for granted. And so Christians could learn to appreciate what we've inherited. And Christianity, as with all long-standing religious traditions, have a sense of tradition, right? We weren't invented yesterday. We have a long history, and our institutions ought to incline us to remember that we're not the first, and that we stand on the shoulders of others. And so there ought to be something in Christians' awareness that the past is, it may deserve to be changed, but it shouldn't be squandered. So that's one thing. And if we're thinking in terms of Burkean conservatism, I think, yes, on the one hand, the Christian is pulled by the hope of the eschaton and the demand to live now as we hope we shall be, and that might require some dramatic changes. But remember that the parables Jesus told about the kingdom of God were all gradualist. The mustard seed, leaven. What was it? What were the other parables? Anyway, those two will do.
Salt, yeah, perhaps.
Sorry, say again?
Perhaps salt.
Yeah, salt, okay. All these things have their effect gradually and subtly and almost invisibly. And that suits a Burkean conception. And remember, in his own day, Jesus rejected the radical utopian revolutionary politics available, which was armed rebellion against the Romans. He was offered that option. I forget which chapter in the Gospel of John says it, but they offered to come and make him king in a kind of straightforward political sense, and he refused. And partly because of where he was in terms of social status, his political action was, as it were, through civil society, gradual, and in some ways a more revolutionary change than what goes on up top. And so one has to acknowledge as a Christian one's hope for the coming of the kingdom of God, and that does put a check on any complacency or simple conservatism. But there's plenty in the Gospels that suggest that a Burkean gradualist stance toward change is a Christian one. Now, so that's what Christians can learn from conservatism. What was it? The final question?
Can they offer to it, perhaps?
Yeah. Okay. So what they offer to it is, no, folks, you can't simply be in favour of the status quo. You can't simply be in favour of the status quo. And if the status quo means systemic injustice, screwing the poor, living off the poor, not acceptable. Not acceptable. So the status quo, current privilege, are subject to judgment and assessment, and might be found wanting. So this has to be if you're conservative as a Christian, you can only be provisionally conservative. Yeah, that's what I think.
Great. Thank you very much. That brings me to the end of my questions. Just remains for me to say thanks so much for giving your time.
Thanks for giving me so much time to say what I think.